The Gestapo was created through the absorption of the Prussian state police, a law enforcement body that investigated political crimes committed in Prussia from the mid-19th century until 1933. The last director of the Prussian state police and the first of the Gestapo was Rudolf Diels, a career policeman, womanizer and brawler who had joined the force thanks to his deep knowledge of urban radical movements. However, the cleansing of enemies of the state undertaken by Diels did not reach the extremes it would later achieve, as during its beginnings the Gestapo was not exclusively formed by Nazis, but rather by a group of policemen who saw the merger of both organizations as an opportunity to prosper. Later on, most of the additions to the Gestapo were indeed recruits from the Nazi sphere, leading this police force to radicalize to unprecedented extremes. By 1933 it had 1,000 men, and by 1944 that number had reached 32,000. A part of the dirty work was done by German society itself, through denunciation. Telling a joke about Hitler in a bar, making unhappy comments about the government, listening to a foreign radio station, or not giving the Nazi salute were grounds for being locked in a cell, hung with chains on a wall, and ending up in the interrogation room in the barracks that neighbors had baptized as the House of Horror. In 1934, Goering replaced Diels as the commander of the Gestapo in Prussia and recommended extending the role of this police force throughout Germany. In fact, in his eagerness to control the Gestapo across the country, Goering clashed with the interests of SS commander Heinrich Himmler, who was the chief of police in Munich and also aimed to take absolute control of the German police system. In this power struggle, Himmler managed to take control of the Bei-Popo, the political police of Bavaria. Ultimately, both men set aside their differences, and Goering transferred all authority of the Gestapo to the SS. However, shortly after, the cold and calculating Reinhard Heydrich, chief of the SD, the SS security service, would take complete control of the body and was appointed commander of the Gestapo, whose headquarters in Berlin were located at Prince Albrechtstrasse number 8, in a building that had formerly been a theatre. Also in 1934, the joint forces of the SS and the Gestapo carried out a series of mass arrests, taking the opportunity to eliminate all those who were troublesome to the interests of the Nazi Party. One of their most notorious actions occurred during what has gone down in history as the Night of the Long Knives, a massacre of members of the SA, a paramilitary group in service to the Nazi Party, also known as the Brown Shirts, of which the total number of victims has not been determined. But what is known is one of the most important figures, their commander, Ernst Röhm, who was executed without trial along with the majority of the leaders of this organization, of which Hitler had begun to distrust. In this way, the Nazi leader rid himself of those he considered dangerous enemies. The Iron Fist, how the Gestapo operated. This secret police force was responsible for investigating and detaining anyone considered a threat to the Nazi regime, including Jews, Roma, homosexuals, political dissidents, communists, and anyone suspected of being against the National Socialist Party. The methods used to obtain information and confessions were brutal, including torture, prolonged interrogations, and threats against family members. In addition to its role in internal repression, the Gestapo also handled security in territories occupied by the Nazis. In this context, it was responsible for implementing extermination policies against Jews and other ethnic and religious minorities, leading to the deaths of millions of people during the Holocaust. The Gestapo had nearly unlimited powers and operated autonomously, without the need to be accountable to any other authority in the Nazi state. Its agents enjoyed impunity and were exempt from any form of legal responsibility, allowing them to act with complete freedom. Historian Frank McDonough, in his work The Intricate Threads of Surveillance, Vanguard Publications, reveals fascinating data on this topic. According to his research, only 15% of surveillance cases began through direct operations of the agency. The rest were the result of reports provided by the civilian population. Among those who provided reports, an overwhelming majority were men, reaching nearly 80%. They mostly came from lower social classes, composed of workers or employees in the commercial sector. Interestingly, husbands rarely denounced their wives. However, women were the main informants, with their accusations mostly directed towards their own spouses. These reports often stemmed from motivations such as revenge for infidelities, prevention of future cases of domestic violence, or abuse. Although women could be victims of rape, beatings, or abuse, this was not sufficient reason for official intervention. Instead, the contrary speech against the regime by the aggressors was enough reason to report them. Numerous reports also arose from personal disputes between friends, neighbors, and colleagues. During the chaos of war, some were arrested simply for expressing pessimistic opinions in a bar. Speech control was absolute. Both parents and housewives avoided any comments against the government for fear of triggering Gestapo interrogation due to family or marital disputes. There were cases where citizens were detained for criticizing the attire of a high-ranking official or their spouse during social gatherings, others for praising writers considered enemies of the regime. There were even cases as absurd as that of a man who turned himself in to the authorities to be detained for a few months as part of his personal strategy to combat his alcohol addiction. The terrible thing was that when a person was arrested by the Gestapo, they lost all their civil rights and were not protected by the law. They could do whatever they wanted with the detainees. Initially, since the German Penal Code prohibited murder and torture, they would simulate the death of those they determined should die. It was organized into 3 divisions. The first was bureaucratic, the second had the mission of annihilating opponents, and the third was in charge of counter-espionage. The Gestapo was the main executor of Germany's anti-Jewish policies. They supervised the liquidation of ghettos and organized the deportation of Jews to concentration and extermination camps. Adolf Eichmann was responsible for coordinating the mass deportations. He ended up living in Argentina and was captured by a Mossad commando in 1960. He was in charge of Section 4B4 of the Gestapo. Additionally, they recruited low-ranking members to join mobile extermination units, which murdered 1.5 million Jews in occupied Russia. As the war broke out and expanded, the Gestapo opened offices in all countries of occupied Europe, being at the peak of power. It had no judicial or legal supervision above it. There were cases of detained individuals who, upon proving their innocence, could leave the barracks alive. Many others were not so lucky and were hung with chains from the walls of the cells. They had to endure unspeakable torture methods, usually applied by career policemen who knew what they were doing and what they had to do. Passing electricity through sensitive areas of the body, submerging them in ice-cold water, burning their fingers with matches, or depriving them of sleep were common practices. Interrogations, the ruthless face of the Gestapo. Interrogations were infamous for their brutality and complete lack of humanity. No regulations were respected, and detainees were entirely deprived of any minimal rights. They were there solely to provide more information or to be subjected to physical punishment for alleged disloyalty. Torture was a common practice, executed with ruthless cruelty that German officers openly boasted about. From waterboarding to the squeezing of testicles with pliers, to electric shocks, facial beatings, prolonged strangulation, and bone fractures, anything was permissible to obtain a confession or denunciation. Some could avoid torment by confessing, but others had to betray several ordinary citizens to ensure their own salvation. However, the mere threat of torture was often enough. The reputation of Gestapo brutality was so widely known that people often spoke before facing torture. The phrase verschärfte Vernehmung, in German enhanced interrogation, was coined in 1937 by the Nazis themselves, describing a form of torture that left no marks. Among the various tortures the Germans implemented, documents from the time reveal practices such as freezing prisoners nearly to death, repeated beatings, prolonged forced standing, waterboarding, cold showers in air-conditioned rooms, stress positions, withholding medication, and leaving injured or sick prisoners alone in cells for days on end, increasing the heat in cells where a prisoner they wanted to interrogate was housed, and sometimes prisoners were asked to sign a written statement, including their name, occupation, rank, and position in the opposing army. Among other atrocities, the Germans used hospitals to starve opponents to death, to the point where they voluntarily requested to share intelligence in exchange for food. But the Nazis' cunning techniques went a step further. They used nurses in hospitals to seduce American and Allied forces, showing them affection and reading them American stories, all part of their master plan that included the use of secret agents to uncover crucial information from enemy army forces. There were exceptions to that rule. Paul Schneider, a Protestant evangelical pastor residing in Fürstfeld, a small rural village in the Rhineland, challenged the regime in 1933 by criticizing some of the new Nazi authorities from his pulpit. He argued that they were carrying out a revolution without seeking a spiritual renewal of the German people. Someone informed the ecclesiastical authorities about his words, and he received a warning. Nevertheless, he continued his preaching discreetly. A year later, the Gestapo managed to prevent him from officiating religious services in 2 other nearby rural villages. Eventually, he was arrested, but the protest of his congregation resulted in his release. Martin Niemöller, another religious figure persecuted by the Gestapo, was a Lutheran pastor who strongly opposed the Nazification of German churches. His courageous stance made him a target of the Gestapo, which arrested him and accused him of activities against the state. Although initially a judge released him, the Gestapo re-arrested him, deeming him deserving of punishment. From then until the end of the war, Niemöller was confined in concentration camps. From one of his speeches in 1946 emerged the famous poem often mistakenly attributed to Bertolt Brecht. The reasons for the persecution of citizens were varied. While the Gestapo initially focused on eliminating communists and more radical political opponents, it later expanded its scope to include any dissident or individual who could threaten the regime's imposed single discourse. Therefore, religious figures, homosexuals, and others considered social outcasts, according to the terminology of the time, as well as various dissidents, were among the Gestapo's regular victims. As Nazi Germany advanced over other European countries, the Gestapo focused on suppressing internal dissent. It is common to believe that once taken to Gestapo headquarters, detainees never emerged. However, the reality was different. Most investigations ended without results, and detainees were released. Only the most prominent and violent cases served as examples to instill terror. Moreover, those who were released proved useful in spreading fear by divulging torture methods and providing names under coercion to keep the wheel of persecution turning. Initially, not all Gestapo agents were Nazis. Initially, they collaborated with existing police officers. Over time, however, they became radicalized, and their methods and motivations became increasingly arbitrary. Popular imagination often portrays Gestapo men in long leather coats, but in reality, most dressed in civilian clothes. Their goal was to blend in and gather information from the population. Although those coats were fashionable, their style manual and instructions required them to wear common clothes and not carry identifying documents. In its early years, the Gestapo focused on eliminating political and religious opponents. However, it quickly joined in racial persecution, enforcing the Nuremberg laws under the pretext of complying with existing regulations. The architects of control, the leaders of the Gestapo. Heinrich Müller, known as Gestapo Müller, emerged as a prominent figure in the Gestapo, his name ominously resonating in the organization's corridors and becoming a legend in his own right. Before the outbreak of World War I, Müller seemed destined for a promising career in aviation as an aircraft mechanic. After completing his apprenticeship in aeronautical mechanics, he enlisted in the German Army's Air Force, excelling as an enemy artillery spotting pilot during the conflict. In 1934, Heinrich Müller joined the SS with number 107,143, quickly rising through the ranks and earning the nickname Gestapo Müller, to distinguish him from another SS general with the same name. By the end of the war, he had reached the rank of general. Since 1935, the robust and rugged appearance of this Bavarian official, with his square, peasant-like head, impassive facial expression with piercing eyes and thin lips, virtually made him the head of the Gestapo, despite not initially being a member of the Nazi Party. In 1936, Müller assumed the position of Chief of Operations of the feared Gestapo, the Nazi political police. Although not a member of the Nazi Party at the time, Heinrich Himmler saw this as an advantage, as Müller could carry out police actions without being tied to party affiliation. Müller personified the purity of duty and discipline, being a workaholic always dedicated to the service his position demanded and to the service of the nation, regardless of which political party was in power. As Chief of Operations of the Gestapo, and later as its leader, Müller played a crucial role in detecting and suppressing all forms of resistance to the Nazi regime. With the trust of Heydrich and Himmler, Müller was instrumental in transforming the Gestapo into the principal executive instrument of National Socialist terror, according to historians Carsten Dams and Michael Stoll. Under his leadership, the Gestapo managed to infiltrate and largely dismantle groups opposed to the Nazi regime, such as the underground networks of the Social Democratic Party and the Communist Party, as noted by historian George C. Browder, who highlights his expertise and fervent aversion to communism as determining factors for his rise and success. When Hitler and military leaders sought a pretext for the invasion of Poland in 1939, Himmler, Heydrich, and Müller devised and executed a false flag operation known as Operation Himmler. During one of the operations, a clandestine mission to a German radio station on the Polish border, Müller participated in the collection of a dozen death row inmates from camps, who were then dressed in Polish uniforms. Müller promised these men that they would be pardoned and released, but instead they were executed with a lethal injection and gunshot wounds to simulate dying in action during a staged attack. These incidents, particularly the simulated attack on the Gliwice radio station, were later used in Nazi propaganda to justify the invasion of Poland, marking the beginning of World War II. On October 6, 1939, Müller ordered Eichmann to prepare the deportation of between 70 and 80,000 Jews from the annexed Polish city of Katowice, an order that also included the deportation of Jews from Ostrava. By September, both the Gestapo and the army had planned this. 12 days later, on October 18, 1939, Müller informed Eichmann that it would soon be necessary to centrally organize the resettlement and relocation of Poles and Jews to the area of the future Polish state through the Reichssicherheitshauptamt. The relationship between Himmler, Müller, and Heydrich was one of close collaboration, where each played a complementary role in the repressive machinery of the Nazi regime. Together, they consolidated state control over the population and were responsible for some of the most atrocious crimes committed during the Holocaust and World War II. Their rise and collaboration marked a dark chapter in human history, where totalitarian ideology and the brutality of power manifested in all their cruelty. Reinhard Heydrich, the sinister hand of the Third Reich. Reinhard Heydrich meticulously delineated the function of the secret police he led with relentless rigor. Our responsibility is to safeguard the German folk in its entirety, protecting its vitality and its institutions from any form of destruction and disintegration. We must repel the attacks of all forces that may weaken or destroy the nation's health. As Himmler's right-hand man, Heydrich was the architect of the Gestapo as we know it, imposing his harshness, lack of nuance, cunning, and shamelessness. Reinhard Heydrich emerged as one of the most feared men of the Third Reich. Obedient, violent, and cruel, his murderous ambition knew no bounds, becoming an essential cog in Nazi barbarism. Heydrich's philosophy was summed up in a blunt maxim: "With me or against me," making him a highly detested figure by the Czechs, even more so than Hitler himself. Heydrich issued relentless orders to ruthlessly persecute those who defied the regime, while generously rewarding those who collaborated with him. In the company of his wife Lena, Reinhard organized opulent gatherings attended by prominent members of Czech society who had demonstrated their loyalty to the Protectorate. These individuals were rewarded with money, trips, and stays in luxurious hotels, in an elaborate game of favors and alliances. Adolf Hitler placed his trust in him, entrusting him with the most ruthless tasks, which he carried out with precision. Heydrich was a criminal technocrat who knew no fear. He quickly rose through the ranks, emerging as a prominent figure within the SS. He supervised the security forces composed of the SS, the Gestapo, and the SD, consolidating his position with cunning and determination. He was involved in notorious events such as the Night of the Long Knives, where he played a crucial role in the elimination of General Strasser, and was the chief architect of Kristallnacht. Additionally, he was the mastermind behind the Wannsee Conference, a turning point where Nazi leaders outlined the abominable final solution. At just 38 years old at the time of his death, his youth and audacity made him a viable candidate to succeed Hitler. When the Führer perceived Czechoslovakia becoming a problematic territory, he sent Heydrich to restore order, a task Heydrich carried out with relentless efficiency. Known by a variety of derogatory nicknames from the Hangman to the Butcher of Prague, Heydrich preferred the title personally bestowed upon him by Hitler, the man with the iron heart. Under his leadership, the Gestapo transformed into a relentless machine of repression, torture and execution, cementing his legacy as one of the most sinister figures of the Nazi regime. Such was his impunity, such was his power, that he was convinced no one could harm him, that no one would dare to attack him. He saw himself as Adolf Hitler's successor. Many others agreed. This 38-year-old man was convinced that his destiny was to dominate the world. On June 4, 1942, Reinhard Heydrich died in a hospital in Prague. 5 days later, his funeral was held in Berlin. It was a state event. All Nazi leaders were present. The last speaker was Hitler himself. He appeared very moved. In the Nazi-subjugated Prague, the atmosphere wasn't saturated with mourning, but with a thirst for justice. Raids followed one after another, offering hefty rewards to those who provided information about the culprits. In those early days, over 70 individuals fell as retaliation. The Germans walked a thin tightrope. On one hand, they sought to impose a lesson to instill even more fear in the population and quench their thirst for revenge. On the other hand, they feared that the relatively calm and accepting climate that had prevailed in much of Czech society until then would abruptly vanish. However, the Germans' thirst for vengeance wasn't quenched with those 70 deaths. They went further by wiping an entire village off the map, Lidice. All its inhabitants, men, women and children, were mercilessly slaughtered. But their fury didn't stop there. Lezaki was the next victim, where men were summarily executed and women and children sent to concentration camps. In total, in those first few weeks, over 1,300 people lost their lives as a consequence of the attempt on Heydrich's life. The Gestapo, path of horror in the Holocaust. The cold bites in the Berlin winter, 15 degrees below zero. Official cars slowly arrive at that imposing mansion on the outskirts of Berlin. The men hurriedly step out to seek refuge in the warmth of the palace's stoves. They wear overcoats and warm gloves. No one wants to be late. They fear the organizer, a young blonde, irate and very ambitious man who seems to know no limits. At noon, the 15 high-ranking Nazi officials, accompanied by ministerial representatives, secretaries and prominent members of the Gestapo, none of whom were part of Adolf Hitler's inner circle, except Reinhard Heydrich, the organizer, gathered around a long table. Tense greetings were exchanged before the meeting, known as the Wannsee Conference, commenced. The date, January 20, 1942, would be etched in history. In less than 90 minutes, the infamous final solution was established. The organizer was Reinhard Heydrich, the blonde beast or the Butcher of Prague. A few months earlier, he had received an order from Hermann Göring. He was to find a solution to the Jewish question, and for them, that meant one thing: final extermination. The meeting began with a lengthy presentation by Heydrich. He spoke with a martial tone, without hesitation, firmly. He explained that he had received directives from Hitler and Göring, and that they had to coordinate the Jewish issue. He gave figures, raised his voice, and pounded the table several times. He had to overact his conviction because he assumed there would be opposition to his ideas. To convince the guests and secure their collaboration, in addition to shouting and giving orders, Heydrich had another plan. He anticipated that the meeting would last quite a while, so for the first break and taking advantage of it being midday, they had prepared a grand banquet. Those serving at the table were instructed never to let the guests' glasses empty. They had the finest brandy in Europe at their disposal. It's important to note that the Nazis were very fond of euphemisms, and that evacuation meant that the Jews would be forcibly sent to those territories, and that there, after being exploited, they would be murdered. It's not that there hadn't been indiscriminate killings up to that point, but from the Wannsee Conference onwards, that behavior was institutionalized and systematized. Official anti-Semitic movements had been occurring since Hitler came to power. But over the years, they increased until they reached the final solution. To execute a plan of such magnitude, they needed the work to be coordinated among all the sectors present, but it was always clear that Heydrich and Himmler would have control of the operations. That was the true purpose of the conference, to clarify Heydrich's authority and prevent internal disputes from arising later on. As the Nazi regime intensified its persecution against the Jews, the Gestapo became the principal instrument of repression and control in the cities of the Reich. The Gestapo organized raids and mass arrests of Jews suspected of subversive activities or challenging the regime's policies. The detainees were interrogated, tortured, and subjected to inhumane conditions in Gestapo prisons, where many lost their lives or suffered serious physical and psychological consequences. Eichmann sent the conclusions of the conference with the stamps "Urgent" and "Top Secret" to the Gestapo and Reich police services. This was the official order that marked the beginning of the final solution. The apparatus was systematically prepared. Rounding up and transporting millions of people was a complicated business. The Gestapo responded as before, making lists of names, lives that were to end. The role of the Gestapo was to locate Jews from all places and send them out of Germany. At the right moment, they would write to the Jews in a location, telling them to gather at the train station from where they would be deported. The Gestapo was in charge of organizing deportations in general. The Gestapo thus acted as a liaison with the Reich railways to coordinate train transport to the east. The Gestapo sought all the help they could find. In occupied territories, they offered rewards to the population in exchange for information about the whereabouts of any Jew. Thousands of letters arrived at different Gestapo offices with such information. However, the letters were not very effective, as it took quite some time to read them, and by the time they were read, the persecuted individuals had usually already changed hiding places. Throughout the Reich, the Gestapo supervised the withdrawal of Jews. Friends and neighbors looked on, but saw nothing. In many cases, it was these same neighbors who had denounced the Jews. In 1942, the Gestapo was organizing deportations throughout the Reich and occupied territories. The excuse the Gestapo used for the movement of people was that of resettlement. It was supposed that the Jews would be resettled in Eastern Europe for their protection and to separate them from the rest of society. Even the Theresienstadt camp, near Prague, was promoted as one of these resettlement places. The transportation system was highly efficient. Trains headed eastward towards the small town of Izbica near Lublin. This small Polish town served as a redistribution ghetto. Jews were taken there, as it was close to the four main extermination camps: Treblinka, Majdanek, Sobibor, and Belzec. From Izbica, trains would send Jews to these camps as required. The tragedy of Sophie Scholl, victim of the Gestapo. Sophie enjoyed drawing and writing. After finishing secondary school, she became a kindergarten teacher and joined the National Public Service, a mandatory instance in which citizens had to provide some service in pursuit of the national cause amid the war. She ended up being a nurse on one of the battlefronts. That sudden and raw contact with reality transformed her. Those faint ideas and almost intuitive thoughts she had about the German reality became certainties when she witnessed the battles, heard soldiers and people from the villages talk. A few months later, she joined her brother Hans in Munich. There, Sophie began to study philosophy and biology. In addition to witnessing artistic performances like never before and enjoying the nightlife, she met other young people who thought like her, who saw the German reality in the same way, who had not been seduced by Nazism. With the impetus of youth, they set out to make their voices heard. Someone reminded them of the actions of the Gestapo. If they were not careful, every oppositional activity, every dissenting movement, and even every criticism made in private constituted a serious risk to their lives. The Gestapo was a golem that grew disproportionately and managed to spread terror and discipline. The secret police designed a macabre and effective system of terror that became flesh in the population. A state of massive and permanent denunciation was generated. A web of fear and persecution was created. The organization managed to convince every German citizen that the state was watching and listening to them. In part, it was true. The Scholls believed that society needed to hear other voices, that someone had to try to open their eyes. Sophie Scholl and her brother Hans, along with other members of the resistance group known as the White Rose, distributed anti-Nazi pamphlets at the University of Munich on February 18, 1943. During the distribution, they were seen by the janitor, who reported them to the Gestapo. That same afternoon, Sophie and Hans were arrested by Gestapo agents at the university. At the time of their arrest, more anti-Nazi pamphlets were found among their belongings. Subsequent interrogations failed to break their determination, and both siblings freely admitted their involvement in distributing the pamphlets. On February 22, 1943, just 4 days after their arrest, Sophie Scholl, her brother Hans, and their friend Christoph Probst were summarily tried by the Nazi People's Court. During the trial, they refused to retract their actions and openly expressed their opposition to the Nazi regime. The verdict was swift and brutal. All 3 were found guilty of treason, desertion, and undermining the morale of the German army, and sentenced to death. That same afternoon, they were executed by guillotine at Stadelheim prison in Munich. Sophie Scholl was only 21 years old at the time of her execution. The courage and sacrifice of Sophie Scholl and the members of the White Rose became a symbol of resistance against the Nazi regime and its brutality. Although they were executed, their legacy endures as a reminder of the importance of courage and resistance in the face of oppression and injustice. Jakob Gapp, witness and martyr in the face of Gestapo barbarism. Jakob Gapp was born in the city of Wartens, Austria in 1897, and after fighting in World War I in the Austrian army, he joined the Society of Mary and was ordained a priest. Due to the strong criticisms he made against Hitler's racism, expressed in his homilies, he had to flee his country persecuted by the Gestapo in 1939, Salaveri explained. After passing through Bordeaux, he arrived in Valencia in 1941, where he was welcomed by the Marianist community of the Colegio del Pilar and served as a chaplain there, as well as teaching German and Latin. In 1942, 2 young Germans, who claimed to be Jewish brothers persecuted by the Nazis, appeared at the school itself and asked for his help, after which a strong friendship was established between them to the point that the young men begged him to instruct them in the Catholic faith to receive baptism, Salaveri added. Days before the scheduled date for the baptismal sacrament, Gapp was invited by the 2 friends to travel with them to San Sebastian, and from there, through deception, they made him pass to Hendaye, already in France, where he was captured by the Gestapo, to which the 2 false Jews belonged. He was then taken to Paris and then to Berlin, where he continuously professed his faith while being tortured until he was finally executed on August 13, 1943, after being sentenced to death by a people's tribunal. Heinrich Himmler himself, supreme leader of the Gestapo, went so far as to say of him that, "With 1,000,000 Jakobs Gap, but of our ideology, we would dominate the world," Salaveri specified. When beatifying him, St. John Paul II ordered that the liturgical feast day of Jacob Gapp be celebrated on August 13th, the day of his martyrdom. During his captivity at the hands of the Gestapo, Jakob Gapp was subjected to terrible physical and psychological torture. Nazi interrogators used brutal methods to try to break his spirit and obtain information about his activities and contacts. It is said that he was brutally beaten, burned with cigarettes, and subjected to long sessions of sleep and food deprivation. Despite the inflicted suffering, Gapp remained steadfast in his faith and convictions, refusing to yield to the pressure of his torturers. His resistance to torture and his refusal to betray his principles made him a symbol of courage and determination in the face of the brutality of the Nazi regime. Although the exact circumstances of his torment may not be known in detail, the inhumane conditions of Gestapo prisons and the interrogation methods used by the secret organization are well documented. Torture was a commonly employed tool to intimidate and punish political prisoners and opponents of the Nazi regime. The Nuremberg Trials, Gestapo facing the law. The Nuremberg Trials, held between 1945 and 1946, marked a historic milestone in the prosecution and trial of those responsible for the crimes committed during the Nazi regime, including the Gestapo. These trials were an opportunity to be held accountable for the horrors of the Holocaust